It was sometime around 3 in the morning on a sweltering summer night in 1996, and two of the most recognizable figures in heavy metal history were sitting on the hood of a rented Lincoln Town car somewhere between Las Vegas and absolutely nowhere. The engine had overheated, the air conditioning had died about 40 minutes earlier, and the only supplies they had were a half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels, a crumpled pack of Marlboro Reds, and a cassette tape of Creedence Clearwater Revival that had been stuck in the stereo since they left the Strip. Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness himself, was wearing a Hawaiian shirt soaked through with sweat, squinting into the pitch-black Nevada desert and mumbling something about scorpions. Beside him, Lemmy Kilmister sat perfectly still, boots planted in the dust, cigarette glowing between his lips, looking like a man who had been lost in far worse places and survived them all. Neither of them had a working phone, neither of them had told anyone where they were going, and neither of them seemed particularly concerned about the fact that they were stranded in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America with no water and no plan. What happened over the next 12 hours would become one of the most legendary untold stories in rock and roll. A night so absurd and so deeply human that everyone who eventually heard it could not decide whether to laugh or cry, and most of them did both. Before we get into what really happened out there in the desert that night, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one do not come around very often, and you will not want to miss what comes next. The setup that nobody saw coming. The whole disaster started innocently enough at the Rainbow Bar and Grill on the Sunset Strip, which had been Lemmy's unofficial living room for the better part of 2 decades. It was a Wednesday evening in late July, and Ozzy had just wrapped up a string of promotional appearances in Lowe's Angels that had left him completely drained. Sharon was out of town handling business in New York, the kids were with their nanny, and Ozzy found himself doing what he always did when he had a free night and an empty house. He drove straight to the Rainbow, parked his car at an angle that suggested he had not looked at the space even once, and walked inside knowing exactly who would be sitting at the far end of the bar. Lemmy was there, of course, because Lemmy was always there. That night, the conversation turned to Vegas. Ozzy mentioned that a friend of his had a private suite at one of the big casinos and that it was sitting empty for the weekend. Lemmy, who had a well-known fondness for slot machines and video poker, did not need much convincing. Within an hour, they were in a rented car heading east on Interstate 15, and the Nevada desert was waiting for them with all of its beautiful, terrible emptiness. The drive from Los Angeles to Las Vegas is roughly 4 hours if you stay on the interstate, which is exactly what most sensible human beings do when crossing a stretch of desert at night. But Ozzy Osbourne and Lemmy Kilmister were not most sensible human beings. About 2 hours into the drive, somewhere past Barstow, where the desert starts to feel like it goes on forever, Ozzy decided that he knew a shortcut. He had heard from someone, though he could never remember who, that there was a back road that shaved off about 40 minutes from the trip. Lemmy, who was busy feeding cassette tapes into the stereo and nursing his Jack Daniels with the calm precision of a man performing surgery, simply shrugged and said nothing, which Ozzy took as full agreement. The exit they took led them onto a 2-lane road that quickly became a 1-lane road that eventually became something that barely qualified as a road at all. The pavement turned to gravel, the gravel turned to packed dirt, and the packed dirt turned to loose sand that made the Lincoln fishtail like a boat in rough water. Ozzy kept driving because Ozzy always kept going once he committed to something, and Lemmy kept drinking because Lemmy always kept drinking regardless of what was happening around him. But neither of them knew it yet, because the real adventure had not even started. What was waiting for them further down that road would test their friendship in ways that no concert, no record deal, and no amount of fame ever could. The Lincoln Town car gave out at approximately 2:45 in the morning, and it did not go quietly. There was a loud hissing sound from under the hood, followed by a cloud of steam that rose into the night sky like a ghost escaping from a coffin, and then the engine simply stopped. Ozzy tried turning the key 3 or 4 times, pumping the gas pedal with the desperate optimism of a man who believed that machines could be persuaded if you just showed them enough enthusiasm. The car did not respond. The dashboard lights flickered once and then went dark, and suddenly the two of them were sitting in a silence so complete that it felt like the entire world had been switched off. The Nevada desert at night is not like anywhere else on Earth. There are no streetlights, no buildings, no distant hum of traffic. There is only the sky, which stretches from horizon to horizon with more stars than most people have ever seen, and the ground, which is flat and dry and indifferent to whatever happens on it. Lemmy was the first one out of the car. He walked around to the front, popped the hood, looked at the steaming engine for about 3 seconds, closed the hood again, and sat down on it. Then he lit a cigarette and poured himself another measure of Jack Daniels into a plastic cup he had brought from the Rainbow. Ozzy stood beside the car for a moment, turning in a slow circle like a man trying to find a landmark in a place where landmarks did not exist. There was nothing in any direction. The temperature had dropped from the daytime furnace into something cooler but still warm, and the only sound was the ticking of the engine as it cooled, and the distant howl of something that might have been a coyote or might have been the wind. This was the moment when most people would have panicked, and what happened next revealed something about these two men that goes far deeper than their music or their fame. Ozzy sat down next to Lemmy on the hood of the dead Lincoln and accepted the bottle of Jack Daniels that was offered to him without a word. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, two men in their late 40s and early 50s, surrounded by millions of years of geological silence, sharing a bottle of whiskey like they had done 1,000 times before in dressing rooms and tour buses and hotel bars across every continent. The panic that might have seized ordinary people simply did not apply to them, and the reason was both simple and profound. These were two men who had spent their entire adult lives in situations that would have broken most people. Ozzy had been fired from Black Sabbath, battled addictions that nearly killed him more times than anyone could count, been arrested, institutionalized, and written off by critics who said he was finished at least once every decade since the 70s. Lemmy had been kicked out of Hawkwind, arrested at the Canadian border, lived on a diet of amphetamines and whiskey for decades, and played shows in venues so rough that the audience threw bottles at the stage as a greeting. Being stranded in a desert with no phone and no transportation was, by their standards, a minor inconvenience. And that was what made the next several hours so remarkable, because instead of arguing or blaming each other or spiraling into anxiety, they did what they had always done best together. They talked. They laughed. They told each other stories that they had never told anyone else. And in doing so, they reminded each other why their friendship had survived everything that the music industry, substance abuse, and the passage of time had thrown at them. The first story came from Lemmy, and it was about the time he accidentally set fire to a dressing room in Hamburg in 1979. He had been trying to light a cigarette while simultaneously adjusting a faulty amplifier, and a spark from the amp had caught a curtain, which caught a tablecloth, which caught a pile of promotional posters that went up like a bonfire within seconds. The fire department came. The venue owner screamed at him in German for 20 minutes, and Lemmy just stood outside smoking the cigarette that had caused the whole mess, watching the chaos with the expression of a man observing something mildly interesting happening to someone else. Ozzy nearly fell off the hood of the car laughing, which encouraged Lemmy to tell another one, this time about a Motorhead show in Brazil, where the crowd was so aggressive that the security guard quit mid-concert and walked out of the venue, leaving the band to fend for themselves against 10,000 fans who wanted to rush the stage. The stories kept coming, one after another, each more ridiculous than the last. Ozzy contributed his own tales, including one about the time he got lost inside his own house after a particularly heavy night and ended up sleeping in a closet because he thought it was a guest bedroom. But between the laughter and the absurdity, something deeper was happening. The stories were not just entertainment. They were proof of survival. Every ridiculous, dangerous, impossible thing that had happened to them was also evidence that they were still here, still breathing, still capable of sitting on the hood of a broken car in the middle of nowhere and finding the whole situation genuinely funny. The desert was listening, and if deserts could laugh, this one would have. Sometime around 5 in the morning, when the first hints of gray were beginning to appear on the eastern horizon, and the bottle of Jack Daniels was approaching critical levels, they heard a sound that was distinctly not the wind. It was a rustling, scratching, clicking sound that came from somewhere behind the car, and it was getting closer. Ozzy, who despite his reputation as the Prince of Darkness was actually terrified of most living creatures that were not dogs, immediately grabbed the only weapon available, which was a small flashlight from the glove compartment that produced a beam so weak it could barely illuminate his own hand. Lemmy did not move from the hood. He simply turned his head slightly toward the sound and took another drag of his cigarette, completely unbothered, as if whatever was out there in the darkness had better be more frightening than the things he had already survived. The source of the noise turned out to be a coyote, a mangy, thin, clearly hungry animal that had been attracted by the smell of the half-eaten gas station sandwich that Ozzy had left on the back seat with the door open. The coyote locked eyes with Ozzy. Ozzy locked eyes with the coyote, and for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was, neither of them moved. Then Ozzy did something that would become one of the most retold parts of this entire story. He raised the flashlight like a microphone, pointed it at the coyote, and let out a sound that was somewhere between his famous scream from Crazy Train and a noise that no human being should be physically capable of producing. The coyote turned and ran so fast that it kicked up a cloud of dust that hung in the air for a full minute. Lemmy watched the entire scene without changing his expression even slightly, waited for the dust to settle, and then said something to Ozzy that was so perfectly delivered and so unexpectedly funny that Ozzy laughed until tears ran down his face, and he had to hold his stomach because it hurt. That single moment in the pre-dawn Nevada desert, with a coyote sprinting for its life and two rock legends wheezing with laughter beside a dead car, was worth more than any platinum record or sold-out arena show either of them had ever experienced. And the night was not over yet, because the desert sunrise was about to deliver one more surprise that neither of them ever forgot. The Nevada sunrise, when it came, was something that stopped both of them mid-sentence and held them in silence for several minutes. The sky went from gray to pale blue to a deep, burning orange that spread across the horizon like someone had spilled fire across the edge of the world. The mountains in the distance, which had been invisible in the darkness, suddenly appeared as dark silhouettes against the flaming sky, and the desert floor was transformed from a featureless void into an endless canvas of red and gold. Neither Ozzy nor Lemmy were men who were typically moved by nature. Their lives had been spent almost entirely indoors, in studios, bars, tour buses, and concert venues where the only light came from stage rigs and neon signs. But that morning, sitting on the hood of a broken Lincoln Town car, they both went completely quiet and watched the sun come up as if they were seeing it for the first time. Lemmy later told a roadie that it was one of the only times in his life that he felt genuinely small, not in a bad way, but in the way that makes you realize the universe is so much bigger than anything you have ever done, and that this is somehow comforting rather than frightening. Ozzy described it in simpler terms. He said it was bloody beautiful and that he wished Sharon had been there, though he admitted that if Sharon had been there, they never would have taken the wrong turn in the first place, because Sharon would have had a map, a phone, a backup plan, and probably a helicopter on standby. The sunrise marked a turning point because daylight brought a new problem. The temperature was rising, the whiskey was gone, the cigarettes were running low, and they needed to find help before the Nevada summer heat turned their funny story into a dangerous one. At approximately 7:30 in the morning, with the temperature already climbing past 90 degrees and the inside of the car becoming an oven, they made the decision to start walking. Lemmy wanted to walk in the direction they had been driving, reasoning that they must eventually hit something. Ozzy wanted to walk back the way they came, reasoning that they had at least seen a gas station about an hour before the car died. They debated this for about 5 minutes, which for two men who had spent their lives making split-second decisions on stage was an unusually long deliberation. In the end, they compromised by picking a direction that was slightly to the north, where Lemmy thought he could see something that might have been a building or might have been a rock formation. They walked for nearly 2 hours through the morning heat, Lemmy in his heavy boots and leather vest looking like he had been dropped onto the surface of Mars, Ozzy in his sweat-soaked Hawaiian shirt stumbling over rocks and cursing at lizards that darted across his path. The conversation during this walk covered everything from the decline of British heavy metal to the proper way to make tea, from Lemmy's theory about why World War II uniforms were better designed than modern military gear to Ozzy's detailed account of every dog he had ever owned. They were dehydrated, exhausted, and completely lost, but they were also having one of the best conversations of their lives because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. The world had been reduced to two men, a dirt road, and the vast, indifferent beauty of the American Southwest. The truck appeared on the horizon like a mirage, shimmering in the heat waves that were already rising from the desert floor. It was a long-haul 18-wheeler, dusty and sun-bleached, driven by a man named Earl who later told a local newspaper that he had been driving that route for 22 years and had never once picked up a hitchhiker. But when he saw two figures stumbling along the side of the road, one of them dressed head to toe in black leather with a distinctive mustache, and the other flailing his arms like a man trying to flag down an airplane, he pulled over because he thought they might be in genuine trouble. Earl did not recognize either of them at first. He saw two middle-aged men who looked like they had been through something significant, covered in dust, sunburned, and smelling strongly of whiskey. It was only after they climbed into the cab and Ozzy started talking that Earl realized who he was sitting next to. The trucker went pale, then red, then started laughing so hard that he had to pull over again because he could not see the road through his tears. Lemmy sat in the passenger seat with the calm dignity of a man being chauffeured in a limousine, and Ozzy sat between them telling the entire story from the beginning with the enthusiasm of a child recounting a trip to an amusement park. Earl drove them to the nearest town, a tiny place called Searchlight, and dropped them at a gas station where they called for help. Before he left, Earl asked for one thing, and it was not an autograph or a photograph. He asked them to tell the story one more time, from the beginning, because he said it was the funniest thing he had ever heard, and he wanted to remember every detail to tell his wife. The story of Ozzy and Lemmy's Nevada desert adventure spread through the rock and roll community, the way all great stories spread, slowly at first, and then everywhere at once. It started at the Rainbow Bar, where Lemmy told it to a few friends over his usual Jack Daniels and Coke, delivered with his trademark deadpan timing that made every detail land like a perfectly placed drumbeat. Ozzy told his version to Sharon, who reportedly went through 3 distinct emotional phases in the span of 5 minutes: fury that he had driven into the desert without telling anyone, relief that he was alive, and then helpless laughter when he got to the part about the coyote and the flashlight. Within weeks, everyone in their circle had heard some version of the night, and each retelling added new layers of detail and comedy. What made the story so enduring was not just the comedy, though the comedy was undeniably brilliant. It was what the story revealed about the two men at its center. In a music industry built on ego, competition, and backstabbing, Ozzy and Lemmy had something that was increasingly rare and genuinely precious. They had a friendship that required nothing from either of them except the willingness to show up and be present. There was no jealousy between them, no scorekeeping, no resentment. Lemmy never envied Ozzy's enormous commercial success, and Ozzy never looked down on Lemmy for choosing artistic integrity over mainstream appeal. They simply enjoyed each other's company in the purest and most uncomplicated way possible, and the desert night had proven that this enjoyment could survive even the most absurd circumstances. Years later, When interviewers asked Ozzy about his favorite memories from a career that spanned more than 5 decades, he would sometimes mention the stadium shows, the platinum albums, the reality television fame, and all the other landmarks that most people would consider the highlights of an extraordinary life. But almost always, he would come back to that night in the desert. He would get a particular look in his eyes, half smile and half something deeper, and he would say that sitting on the hood of that car with Lemmy, watching the sun come up over the Nevada mountains with nothing but an empty whiskey bottle and a friendship that needed no explanation, was one of the realest moments he had ever experienced. In a life defined by excess, by louder and bigger and more and faster, that night was the opposite of all of it. It was quiet. It was simple. It was two old friends sharing stories under the stars, and it was enough. Lemmy, when asked about the same night, gave a much shorter answer that somehow said even more. He said it was a good night and that Ozzy should not be allowed to drive, and then he changed the subject, because Lemmy never believed in explaining the things that mattered most. When Lemmy died on December 28, 2015, just 4 days after his 70th birthday, Ozzy was one of the first people to release a statement. It was short, emotional, and stripped of all the rock star bravado that both men had worn like armor for their entire careers. Among the many things Ozzy said about his friend, one line stood out to everyone who had ever heard the Nevada desert story. He said that Lemmy was the kind of man who could make you laugh when the whole world was falling apart, and that the world was a quieter, colder, and significantly less fun place without him. Those who knew about that night in '96 understood exactly what he meant. The desert was still out there, the stars still came out every night, and somewhere on a dusty back road between Las Vegas and nowhere, the ghost of a broken-down Lincoln Town car still held the memory of two men who proved that the greatest adventure in rock and roll was never about the music. It was about the people you chose to get lost with. And Ozzy Osbourne and Lemmy Kilmister chose each other, over and over again, for 40 years, in a friendship that needed no stage, no audience, and no applause. Just a bottle of Jack Daniels, a pack of Marlboros, and the honest company of someone who understood exactly who you were and never once asked you to be anything different.